In a quiet city where neighborhoods once thrived, an unseen darkness begins to spread. Behind polished smiles and business suits, a powerful man named Charles Barrett pulls the strings, using intimidation and fear to dismantle communities, drive families from their homes, and seize what does not belong to him. But when Barrett's men target the wrong person, a woman sitting alone in a park, everything begins to unravel. Her name is Danielle Hayes. A former Navy SEAL with a past forged in battle, she's no easy target. What begins as a confrontation with a group of thugs quickly unravels into something much larger, a network of corruption, greed, and organized fear that has terrorized innocent people for far too long. As Danielle digs deeper, she uncovers shocking truths and faces ruthless enemies who will stop at nothing to silence her. Along the way, she finds unexpected allies and a community willing to fight back, showing her that real, lasting change, comes not from one person's strength, but from the unity of those who refuse to back down. But will Danielle's relentless pursuit of justice come at a cost too great to bear? And can one person's fight inspire a broken community to rise again? The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows over the park. The air was calm, broken only by the laughter of children on the swings and the distant bark of a dog chasing its tail. Danielle Hayes sat alone on a weathered bench near a small pond, a worn black leather jacket folded neatly beside her. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the faint breeze brush against her face. It was one of the few peaceful moments she allowed herself these days. Danielle was not the kind of woman to sit idly. Her life had been shaped by action, discipline, and survival. A former Navy SEAL, she had spent years overseas in war zones that had tested every part of her body, mind, and spirit. But now, back in civilian life, she found herself alone, adrift in a quiet city that seemed oblivious to people like her. The battles she fought now were smaller, quieter, but in some ways harder to win. Her apartment was modest but clean, a small one-bedroom on the edge of the city. The white walls were bare except for a photo of her parents on the nightstand and a neatly folded American flag sent to her after her father, a Vietnam veteran, passed away. Danielle did not need much. She spent most of her time out of the apartment, as the silence within those walls reminded her how empty life had become since she left the military. Danielle adjusted her posture on the bench, eyes drifting over the park. The routine of watching people come and go, of losing herself in their normalcy, was comforting in its own way. A jogger passed, giving her a small nod of acknowledgement. She returned it with the faintest of smiles. Moments like that, a brief connection, kept her tethered to this world. Yet her instincts, honed by years of combat, were never silent. Danielle noticed the small things. The way a man near the swings shuffled awkwardly, a group of teenagers loitering a little too long near the playground, the edge of tension in the air. She breathed deeply and told herself to relax. It was not until she saw the four men across the park that her sense of unease sharpened. They stood near a tall oak tree, their posture casual, but their movements deliberate, like predators scanning for prey. The leader, a tall man with broad shoulders and a shaved head, leaned against the tree, watching the park with cold eyes. Danielle's gaze met his for just a second before she looked away, careful not to engage. "You are imagining things," she whispered to herself, but deep down, she knew better. The leader nudged one of the men beside him, gesturing toward Danielle with a jerk of his chin. Laughter erupted from their group, sharp, cruel laughter that cut through the serenity of the park like a blade. Danielle tensed, her pulse quickening ever so slightly. Her instincts had been right after all. The men began to move toward her, their conversation growing louder as they crossed the gravel path. Danielle kept her posture relaxed, one arm draped across the back of the bench, the other resting loosely on her lap. Years of training told her not to reveal her readiness. Let them underestimate you. The leader reached the path in front of her first. His heavy boots crunched on the gravel as he stopped, a smug grin splitting his face. "Afternoon, lady," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Mighty nice day for sitting out here all alone, don't you think?" Danielle looked up slowly, keeping her expression neutral. "It was," she replied evenly. "What do you want?" The man's grin widened, revealing teeth yellowed by years of cigarettes. Behind him, his crew, 3 younger men with cocky postures, snickered. "Now that's no way to greet friendly folks just out for a chat," the man said, his tone oily. "You got something against a little company?" Danielle's sharp gaze darted between them, her mind assessing distances and angles. She could tell these men were not looking for money or a bag. This was about power. It was about making someone feel small, about feeding on fear. They thought they had found an easy target. "You have about 10 seconds to walk away," Danielle said quietly, her voice like steel. One of the younger men laughed, stepping closer. "Oh, she thinks she is tough. What do you say, Ray? Should we teach her a lesson?" Ray, the leader, tilted his head, his smugness hardening into something darker. "Lady, you are outnumbered," he said coldly. "Now, hand over the bag, and maybe we will leave you alone." Danielle exhaled slowly, her muscles coiling as she stood up. She was not tall, but her posture shifted in a way that gave her presence like a coiled spring ready to strike. The men hesitated for just a moment, startled by the change. "I am going to give you one last chance," Danielle said, her voice calm but unyielding. "Walk away." "Or what?" one of the younger men jeered. "You are going to call the cops?" Danielle shook her head. "No, I do not need them." The man lunged first. It was sloppy anger clouding his judgment. Danielle sidestepped smoothly, grabbing his arm and using his momentum against him. In one fluid motion, she twisted sharply and sent him sprawling onto the gravel path. He yelped in pain as the other 3 froze. Shocked, Ray's expression turned from smug to furious. "Get her!" he barked. The next man charged, swinging wildly. Danielle ducked his punch, drove her elbow into his ribs, and sent him staggering backward. She turned, blocking a 3rd man's strike with precision, before shoving him to the ground with a sweep of her leg. By the time Ray stepped forward, his crew lay groaning around him. Danielle straightened, her breathing steady despite the burn of adrenaline in her veins. Ray's fists clenched as he glared at her. "You think this is over?" Danielle's voice was ice. "Yes, it is." From a distance, the faint sound of sirens grew louder. Someone must have called the police. Ray cursed under his breath, throwing one last venomous glare at Danielle before barking at his men. "Let's go!" The group scrambled to their feet, stumbling as they fled across the park. Danielle stayed rooted in place, watching them disappear into the trees. Only when she was sure they were gone did she allow herself to exhale. Minutes later, 2 squad cars pulled up, their lights flashing red and blue across the park. An officer stepped out, Detective Mike Dawson, a tall man with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. He approached Danielle cautiously. "We got a call about a disturbance," Dawson said, his eyes flicking to the gravel path where faint scuff marks remained. "Are you okay?" Danielle nodded. "I am fine." Dawson studied her carefully. He had seen plenty of situations like this, but never one where the victim walked away untouched while the aggressors fled. "Did they hurt you?" "No," Danielle said simply. "They are gone now." The detective glanced around, his brow furrowing. "Do you know them? Was this random?" Danielle hesitated, thinking of the cruel laughter and the way they had singled her out. "It was not random," she said finally. "They knew what they were doing." Dawson's expression darkened. "We have had reports of similar incidents recently, groups harassing people in public spaces. If you can describe them, it will help." Danielle gave him their descriptions, sharp and precise, her memory flawless. As Dawson scribbled notes, he looked up at her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. You handled yourself better than most. Danielle's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. I have had practice. As the officers cleared the area, Danielle stayed on the bench for a moment longer, the park quieting around her. She glanced down at her hands, now steady, and realized something had shifted inside her. This was not over. Those men would be back, maybe not here, maybe not for her, but for someone else, and she could not let that happen. For the first time in a long while, Danielle felt a purpose, a spark she had thought was long extinguished. She stood, pulling her leather jacket over her shoulders as the last of the police cars pulled away. The shadows of the park stretched long before her as she walked toward the horizon, her steps steady, her resolve stronger than ever. Danielle walked back to her apartment as the sun began to set, her thoughts swirling like a storm. The encounter in the park still burned fresh in her mind, their laughter, their sneers, the casual way they tried to make her feel small. For years, she had carried herself through life with the quiet confidence of a soldier, a protector. She thought she had seen the worst humanity had to offer during her deployments overseas. But moments like today reminded her that war zones were not the only places where people fought battles. Her footsteps echoed softly in the stairwell as she climbed to the third floor of her building. It was an old complex, the kind of place where neighbors rarely greeted each other, where the creak of footsteps or the distant cry of a baby was the closest thing to company. The walls were faded, and the hallway always smelled faintly of dust and reheated food. Yet to Danielle, it was enough. She had survived with less. Unlocking the door to her apartment, Danielle stepped inside and flicked on the light. The glow from the single bulb illuminated the sparsely furnished room. A small kitchen sat in the corner, its counters bare, except for a coffee maker and a cup left to dry in the sink. In the living room, an old couch faced a small TV, the remote sitting untouched on the coffee table. A folded blanket rested on one end, the only sign of comfort in the otherwise sterile space. Danielle sighed as she unzipped her jacket and draped it carefully over the back of a chair. The quiet settled around her like a weight, pressing on her shoulders. It was strange how silence could feel so loud sometimes. Her thoughts drifted to the man who had led the attack. Ray Curtis, the name rolled through her mind like a stone. His anger, his control over the others, the way he watched her with hatred in his eyes, it all lingered. But what troubled her more was the sense that this was not just about her. These were not random thugs looking for trouble. There was something larger at play, something that made Ray and his crew confident enough to harass people in broad daylight. Danielle pulled a bottle of water from the fridge and sat at the small table. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as she stared at the far wall, thinking. She knew the police would do what they could, but it was not enough. People like Ray slipped through cracks all the time. If she wanted to get to the bottom of this, she needed to dig deeper. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, Lisa Grant. Danielle smiled faintly and answered, "Hey, Lisa." "Hey, yourself," Lisa's voice crackled over the line, sounding both relieved and concerned. "I saw the police blotter. That was you in the park today, wasn't it?" Danielle sighed. "News travels fast." "Danielle, what happened?" Danielle paused, her fingers tracing the condensation on the water bottle. "A group of guys thought I was an easy target. They were wrong." Lisa's tone sharpened. "Are you okay?" "I am fine. They ran off when the cops showed up." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Lisa was not one to let things drop easily. She had been a journalist for nearly a decade, and her determination to chase the truth had made her both fearless and relentless. It was one of the things Danielle admired most about her. "This was not random, was it?" Lisa asked finally. Danielle leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. "No, it was not. I do not think I was the first person they have done this to." Lisa's voice softened. "I have been hearing stories, Danielle. Reports of people minorities especially being harassed in public spaces. Nothing that makes headlines, but enough to feel like a pattern. Danielle straightened, her brow furrowing. What kind of reports? Small things at first: vandalism, verbal harassment, people feeling unsafe in parks or on their streets. But over the past few weeks, it has escalated. A couple of shop owners said their businesses were targeted, windows smashed, hateful graffiti left behind. The police write it off as random acts of violence, but I am not so sure. Danielle's pulse quickened. Her instincts had been right. This was not just about her. Who do you think is behind it? Danielle asked. That is what I want to find out, Lisa said, but I need help. The police are stretched thin, and most of the victims are too scared to speak up. Danielle, you saw these guys up close. You know what they are capable of. Danielle's hand tightened around the water bottle. You want me to help you? Lisa's tone turned pleading. Think about it. You are smart, you are trained, and let's be honest, you do not scare easily. You could help me connect the dots, get answers. Maybe stop this before it gets worse. Danielle was silent for a long moment. She had spent her life serving others, protecting those who could not protect themselves. And yet, since leaving the military, she had pulled back from the world, keeping her distance. It had been easier to live that way alone, untouchable. But sitting in her small apartment now, the silence pressing in around her, Danielle felt a flicker of purpose. All right, she said finally, I will help you. The next day, Danielle met Lisa at a small cafe downtown. The place was warm and inviting, a sharp contrast to the harsh chill of the outside world. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting soft patterns across the wooden tables. Lisa was already there when Danielle arrived, her laptop open and a half-empty cup of coffee beside her. She looked up as Danielle approached, relief flooding her face. I did not think you would come, Lisa admitted with a grin. Danielle shrugged. I said I would help? Lisa gestured to the chair across from her, and Danielle sat down. Lisa pulled up a map on her screen, red pins marking various points across the city. These are all the places where incidents have been reported in the past few months, Lisa said. Parks, small businesses, neighborhoods, places that were targeted for no obvious reason. But look at this. She zoomed out, and Danielle frowned as the pattern became clear. All the incidents were clustered in areas where minority communities lived and worked. This is not random, Danielle murmured. No, it is not, Lisa agreed. And I think it is organized. Someone is funding these groups, giving them the confidence to terrorize people openly. Danielle's stomach tightened. She thought of Ray's crew, the way they had laughed, so sure of themselves. Do you think these guys are connected to something bigger? Lisa nodded. I do. There is someone pulling the strings, someone who benefits from creating chaos and fear. Danielle leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had seen this kind of organized intimidation overseas, but it was chilling to see it happening here, in her own city. As they talked, the cafe owner, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached their table. Can I get you two anything else? She asked, her voice soft. Lisa smiled. Just the check, please. The woman shook her head. It is on the house. I overheard some of your conversation. It is good to see people like you trying to make a difference. Danielle blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Thank you, she said quietly. The woman smiled warmly. Sometimes the smallest actions can make the biggest difference. Keep doing what you are doing. Danielle watched her walk away, her heart unexpectedly lighter. It was a small gesture, a free cup of coffee, but it reminded her that there were good people out there, people willing to stand together against hate. Lisa closed her laptop and looked at Danielle. Ready to get started? Danielle nodded, a spark of determination flaring in her chest. Let's find out who is behind this. As they left the cafe, Danielle felt something shift inside her. For the first time in months, She was not just surviving, she was fighting for something bigger than herself. And she was ready. The morning light streamed through the cafe windows as Danielle and Lisa stood outside, their conversation lingering in the brisk air. Danielle's gaze swept the quiet street, her instincts always attuned to her surroundings, even when things seemed calm. Lisa tucked her laptop under her arm and gave Danielle a thoughtful look. "So, what now?" Lisa asked, brushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. Danielle's eyes narrowed as she considered their next steps. "We start with Ray Curtis. He is the key to all of this." Lisa frowned. "Ray? You think he will just hand over answers?" "Not willingly," Danielle replied, "but I know his type. He is not the mastermind, he is just a piece of the machine. Guys like Ray are arrogant, but they are not loyal when things get tough. If we find the right pressure point, he will crack." Lisa let out a skeptical laugh. "You make it sound so simple. Where do we even find him?" Danielle glanced down the street, her mind already working through the possibilities. Guys like Ray always have a place, a bar, a warehouse, somewhere they think no one will come looking. "I need to ask around." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "How exactly do you plan to ask around?" Danielle turned back to her, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Not the way you would." By early afternoon, Danielle found herself on the rougher side of town, where the sidewalks cracked beneath her boots and the buildings bore the scars of neglect. She moved with purpose, her sharp gaze scanning the familiar signs of trouble-tagged walls, broken windows, and groups of men who lurked in doorways, watching strangers a little too closely. It had been years since she had walked streets like these. Growing up, Danielle had seen her share of rough neighborhoods. Her father always told her, "Pay attention to how people move, Danny. Trouble announces itself long before it arrives." She heard his words in her mind as she moved through the area, every instinct on high alert. Danielle stopped at a small convenience store with bars across its windows. The clerk, a wiry man in his 50s with tired eyes, looked up warily as she stepped inside. "Afternoon," Danielle said, her voice even. "What do you need?" the clerk asked, his tone flat. Danielle leaned casually against the counter. "Information." The man's expression hardened. "We don't sell that here." "I am not a cop," she said firmly. "I am looking for someone. Ray Curtis. Big guy, shaved head, likes to cause trouble." The clerk's eyes flickered with recognition, but he said nothing. Danielle softened her tone. "Listen, I am not here to cause problems. I am trying to stop something worse before it happens." The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the empty street beyond the window. "Why do you care?" Danielle paused, considering her words. "Because people like him thrive when good people stay quiet. I know what it feels like to think no one is coming to help. I want to change that." Something in her voice must have struck a chord because the man sighed, rubbing his chin. "Ray hangs out near the old industrial warehouses. Fletcher Street, third building on the left." Danielle nodded her thanks and turned to leave. Before she stepped outside, the clerk called after her. "Be careful out there," he said quietly. "Those guys don't play fair." Danielle gave him a small nod. "Neither do I." By the time Danielle reached the industrial side of town, the sun was sinking low, casting an orange haze across the rusted factories and forgotten warehouses. Fletcher Street was empty, a ghost of its former self, with boarded-up windows and weeds breaking through cracked pavement. The third building on the left stood out. A single flicker of movement through a grimy window confirmed that someone was inside. Danielle approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows. Her SEAL training kicked in instinctively silent steps, careful observation, anticipating every possibility. She stopped near a broken window at the side of the building and crouched low, listening. Inside, voices echoed faintly through the cavernous space. She recognized Ray's low growl almost immediately. "I told you already, lay low for a while," Ray snapped, his frustration clear. Another man responded, his voice sharp and accusatory. You think we can sit around while she's out there asking questions? She knows what we're up to, Ray. Danielle's pulse quickened. They're talking about me. Calm down, Ray barked. She's just one woman. What's she gonna do? A third voice, younger and more uncertain, chimed in. She took us apart in the park. You didn't see her, Ray? She's different. Danielle smirked faintly to herself. They were rattled. Good. What are you, scared? Ray sneered. Grow up. If she comes poking around, we'll handle her, just like the others. That was enough for Danielle. She moved silently around to the back entrance, her heart steady, but her mind racing. How many of them are there? Ray and at least 2 others, she figured. Not terrible odds. The rusted door creaked as she pushed it open, and for a brief moment, the voices inside fell silent. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy boots scraping across the concrete floor. Danielle stepped inside, the warehouse dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The space smelled of oil and decay. Ray stood at the center, flanked by 2 younger men, who tensed the moment they saw her. Well, well, Ray drawled, a crooked grin spreading across his face. Look who came looking for trouble. Danielle ignored his bravado, her eyes locked on his. We need to talk, Ray, Ray scoffed. You've got guts, lady. I'll give you that. But you're on the wrong side of town. Danielle took a slow step forward. And you're running out of places to hide. I know you're not the one pulling the strings, Ray. You're just the middleman. Tell me who's really behind this, and maybe you won't spend the rest of your life in a cage. Ray's grin faltered, just slightly. You don't know what you're talking about. I think I do, Danielle said, her voice low and steady. This isn't just you. Someone's paying you to do their dirty work. Who is it? One of the younger men shifted nervously, glancing at Ray. Ray, maybe we should… Shut up, Ray snapped, his voice sharp. He turned back to Danielle, his expression hardening. You think you're gonna scare me? I've been dealing with people like you my whole life. Danielle's gaze stayed locked on his, unflinching. No, you haven't. The tension hung thick in the air. Ray's bravado was a shield, but Danielle could see the cracks. He was not untouchable, and he knew it. Before Ray could respond, the faint sound of approaching sirens cut through the silence. The younger men looked at each other in panic. Cops, one of them muttered. Danielle stepped back, her voice calm but commanding. It's over, Ray. Walk away from this while you still can. Ray's jaw tightened, but the sound of the sirens grew louder. Finally, he cursed under his breath and motioned to his crew. We're leaving. Now. The 3 men pushed past Danielle, their footsteps echoing through the warehouse as they fled into the night. Danielle let them go. For now, moments later, a familiar figure entered through the back door, Detective Mike Dawson, flashlight in hand. He looked at Danielle with a mix of relief and exasperation. I should have known you'd be here, he said, shaking his head. Danielle shrugged, her expression unreadable. I got you what you needed, didn't I? Dawson sighed, gesturing toward the warehouse. We'll sweep the place, but you can't keep putting yourself in the middle of this. You're lucky we got here when we did. Danielle looked out into the night, her resolve unwavering. Luck had nothing to do with it. As Dawson radioed for backup, Danielle stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. She knew this was far from over, but she also knew one thing for certain. Ray Curtis was not untouchable, and neither was the man pulling his strings. The next morning, Danielle sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, staring at a steaming cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the faint hum of traffic outside. Last night's events lingered in her mind. Ray Curtis, the faint cracks in his confidence, and the way he had fled when the sirens came too close. She could still see his face twisted with a mix of anger and fear. He was scared of something, or someone. Danielle leaned back in her chair, her muscles stiff from a restless night. The police had swept the warehouse after Ray and his crew disappeared, but they found nothing concrete, no weapons, No plans, no names. It was just another dead end. Detective Dawson, though annoyed with her methods, had begrudgingly admitted that Danielle had rattled Ray. He promised to keep looking, but Danielle knew what that really meant. Clogged systems, endless red tape, the same cycle she had seen too many times before. If you want something done right, you do it yourself. A knock at the door broke her from her thoughts. Danielle stood quickly, her instincts firing up. She glanced through the peephole and relaxed slightly when she saw Lisa standing outside, holding her laptop bag and a takeaway coffee. "Morning," Lisa said when Danielle opened the door. Her sharp eyes immediately scanned the room as she stepped inside. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," Danielle admitted, closing the door. "I keep turning it over in my head. Ray knows something he just hasn't broken yet." Lisa placed the coffee cup on the table and dropped into the chair across from Danielle. "You're probably right, but we can't rely on Ray to talk. If he's scared, it's for a reason. Whoever is running this operation is bigger than him. He's not just a bully in a warehouse. He's a puppet." Danielle looked at her sharply. "A puppet for who?" Lisa pulled out her laptop and opened it, the screen illuminating her determined face. "I did some digging last night after I got home. I cross-checked the locations where these attacks have happened. Parks, small businesses, apartment buildings. You know what all those places have in common?" Danielle frowned. "Minority neighborhoods." "Yes," Lisa said, her voice tight. "But there's more. All those neighborhoods sit near areas that have been flagged for redevelopment projects. Properties that have been bought up for cheap over the past 2 years. And you know whose name keeps showing up on those purchase agreements?" Danielle leaned forward. "Who?" Lisa spun the laptop screen around, and Danielle's stomach turned as she read the name at the top of the document. Charles Barrett. The photo accompanying the article showed a middle-aged man with perfectly combed silver hair, a tailored navy suit, and a smile that looked more calculated than genuine. Charles Barrett, a successful real estate developer, with his hands in everything from construction projects to community partnerships. To the public, he was a philanthropist, a businessman praised for revitalizing struggling areas. But Danielle recognized the type immediately. "That smile's fake," Danielle muttered. Lisa nodded grimly. "Barrett's real estate empire is a front. I traced some of his investments to shell companies groups with vague names like Community Solutions LLC and Urban Development Partners. These companies are funneling money into organizations that have ties to hate groups. It's subtle, but it's there." Danielle clenched her fists on the table. "He's driving people out, terrorizing them until they leave their homes, their businesses then buying the properties cheap." "Exactly," Lisa said. "He's pulling the strings, and guys like Ray Curtis are his enforcers. They keep the fear alive so Barrett can keep his hands clean." Danielle's jaw tightened as she stared at Barrett's smug photo. "I've seen men like him before. They hide behind their money, their suits, their charities, all while using people like pawns. The question is, how do we stop him?" Lisa's fingers flew across her keyboard as she spoke. "We need evidence that ties Barrett directly to these hate groups. The financial records are suspicious, but not enough on their own. If we can show that Barrett is paying people like Ray to intimidate these neighborhoods, we can expose him." Danielle thought back to last night. "Ray said something that stuck with me. He told his guys to lay low for a while. That means Barrett knows we're getting too close. He's trying to keep quiet. Which also means Ray's scared," Lisa added. "That gives us an opening. If we can make him talk, we might be able to connect Barrett to all of this." Danielle exhaled slowly, a plan forming in her mind. "I need to find Ray again. He's running scared, and scared people make mistakes. If I push him the right way, he'll give Barrett up." Lisa frowned. "And what happens if Ray doesn't break? What if this gets dangerous?" Danielle's eyes were cold and steady. "It's already dangerous." Later that afternoon, Danielle found herself back on the streets she had walked the night before. Fletcher Street was quiet now, the abandoned warehouses looming like forgotten sentinels. She moved carefully, staying out of sight as she watched for any sign of Ray's crew. She spotted him near a rusted chain-link fence behind an auto repair shop. Ray leaned against the wall, smoking a cigarette while talking to a younger man, a wiry kid with nervous energy. Danielle recognized him as one of the crew from the park. Danielle waited until the younger man walked away before she stepped out of the shadows. Ray looked up at the sound of her boots on gravel, his face twisting with surprise and anger. "You again," he growled, pushing off the wall. "What do you want?" Danielle closed the distance between them, her posture calm but unyielding. "We need to talk, Ray." "I've got nothing to say to you," he snapped, flicking his cigarette to the ground. "Maybe not," Danielle said coolly. "But if you keep running, you're going to find yourself in a cage for the rest of your life. The police are closing in. Your friends are going to flip on you if they haven't already." Ray's eyes narrowed, but Danielle saw the flash of doubt in his expression. "You're not the top dog here, Ray," Danielle continued. "You're just a tool. Someone is paying you to do their dirty work, and you're going to take the fall for it. But here's the thing, guys like Barrett don't protect their tools. The second you're a liability, he'll cut you loose." Ray flinched at the name, his body tensing. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do," Danielle said firmly. "Charles Barrett, he's the one pulling the strings. I want you to help me bring him down." Ray shook his head violently. "You don't get it. You think he's just some guy in a suit? He's got people everywhere. You go after him, and you end up in a ditch. I'm not risking my life for that." Danielle stepped closer, her voice low but sharp. "You're risking your life already. How many people has Barrett hurt? How many families has he driven out? You think this ends well for you? You've seen what I can do, Ray. I'm not backing down. But if you help me, I can help you." Ray stared at her, his face a mix of anger, fear, and something else, conflict. The silence stretched between them before he finally muttered, "I don't know anything." "Then find out," Danielle said, "because sooner or later, Barrett's going to throw you under the bus, and when he does, you'll wish you had someone on your side." Ray swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the side as if someone might be watching. "You don't know what you're asking me to do." "I do," Danielle replied, "but you know it's the right thing." Ray's shoulders slumped slightly as he looked away. "Give me time." Danielle nodded once. "Don't take too long. You're running out of it." As Danielle walked away, she glanced over her shoulder to see Ray still standing there, staring at the ground. The cracks in his armor were widening. He was scared of Barrett, of the consequences, but she had planted a seed of doubt. Now she just had to hope it would grow before it was too late. The hum of the city grew quieter as Danielle sat on the worn-out couch in her apartment that evening. The single lamp beside her cast a muted glow, chasing away the encroaching shadows. She stared at her phone, waiting. Ray had asked for time, but she knew time was a luxury he could not afford. She had seen the fear in his eyes. He was close to breaking, yet something held him back, fear of what Barrett would do, or perhaps fear of what he would become if he turned on the man who had been pulling his strings. Danielle rubbed her temples, frustration settling in. How many times had she seen this same story play out? People caught in someone else's web, too scared to fight back, and too lost to realize there was a way out. It reminded her of men she had served with, overseas men who believed that following orders absolved them of responsibility. It never did. The quiet was broken by a knock at the door. Danielle's head snapped up, her senses immediately alert. She rose silently and moved to the door, glancing through the peephole. A familiar face stared back. "Lisa," Danielle muttered, pulling open the door. Lisa stepped inside, her face lit by both excitement and exhaustion. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her laptop bag hung loosely over her shoulder. She carried 2 cups of coffee, one of which she handed to Danielle without a word. "I figured you needed this," Lisa said, dropping into the armchair. "You look like you've been thinking too much." Danielle cracked a faint smile. "I have been. Did you find anything new?" Lisa set the coffee cup on the table and pulled out her laptop. "I kept digging into Barrett's financials. You were right. Ray is scared because Barrett doesn't leave loose ends. I found a few contractors, laborers, and foremen who worked on Barrett's redevelopment projects. Guess what happened to them when they started asking too many questions?" Danielle's jaw tightened. "They disappeared," Lisa nodded grimly, "or they turned up in another state, suddenly unemployed and silent. Barrett's operations are clean on paper, but his methods are anything but. He uses fear to keep people like Ray in line. And anyone who talks, they are cut out." Danielle leaned against the wall, staring at the floor. "Ray's next. He knows it. That's why he's so hesitant." "Exactly," Lisa said. "We need to make Ray see that working with us is his only way out. If Barrett finds out Ray's been talking or even thinking about it, it won't end well for him." Danielle crossed her arms, her voice firm. "I need to get Ray alone again, somewhere he feels safe enough to talk." Lisa looked skeptical. "And how are you going to convince him to do that?" Danielle paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think he knows deep down that Barrett doesn't care about him. Ray's just another tool, like the others. If I can get through to that part of him, I might have a chance." Lisa sighed, closing her laptop. "Just be careful, Danielle. Barrett isn't just some shady businessman. He's got power, connections. If he realizes we're closing in on him, things are going to get ugly fast." Danielle nodded. "I'm ready for that." Lisa stared at her for a long moment, her voice softening. "You always act like you're carrying the whole world on your shoulders. You know you don't have to do this alone, right?" Danielle glanced at her, something unspoken flickering in her eyes. "Sometimes it feels like I do." Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but Danielle cut her off. "I'll let you know what I find." The next evening, Danielle sat in her truck outside the auto repair shop where she had found Ray before. She had a feeling he would return. Men like him were creatures of habit. The street was dimly lit, the flickering glow of an old streetlight casting shifting shadows across the cracked pavement. Danielle sipped from a thermos of coffee, her eyes locked on the shop's back entrance. Her patience paid off. Ray appeared just after dusk, stepping into the alley with his shoulders hunched and his head down. He looked worn, like a man carrying too much weight on his back. Danielle slipped out of her truck and moved quietly across the alley, her footsteps muted on the gravel. Ray leaned against the wall, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. He did not notice her until she spoke. "Ray." He flinched violently, nearly dropping his lighter. "You again?" he spat, his voice laced with both anger and fear. "We need to talk," Danielle said calmly, stepping into the light so he could see her face. Ray's eyes darted around the alley. "I already told you I don't know anything. Just leave me alone." "You know more than you're saying," Danielle replied. "And if you don't talk to me, Barrett's going to come after you next. You're disposable to him, Ray. You know that." Ray shook his head, his voice cracking. "You don't get it. Guys like Barrett, he's got eyes everywhere. If I talk, I'm done." Danielle took a step closer, her voice steady but unyielding. "If you don't talk, you're done anyway. You think Barrett is going to let you walk away? You think he's going to risk someone like you knowing too much? He's already cut others loose, hasn't he?" Ray's face paled, his shoulders slumping against the wall. Danielle could see the conflict tearing him apart, fear of Barrett on one side, the weight of his conscience on the other. "I can't," Ray muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Danielle softened her tone. "Ray, listen to me. You're not the only one Barrett's hurt. He's terrorizing entire neighborhoods. People are scared to go to their parks, scared to go to work, because of what he's doing. You don't have to be a part of that anymore." Ray looked at her, his expression haunted. What do you want from me? The truth, Danielle said simply. You help me bring Barrett down, and I'll make sure you're protected. You don't have to do this alone. Ray stared at her for what felt like an eternity, his jaw working as if he was chewing over every word. Finally, he exhaled shakily and looked away. There's a warehouse on Carson Street, he muttered. Barrett's people meet there once a week tomorrow night. They move cash, hand out orders. That's all I know. Danielle nodded. It's a start. Ray's voice dropped lower, almost pleading. You didn't hear that from me. If they find out I talked. They won't, Danielle said firmly. I'll take it from here. Ray looked at her one last time, his eyes hollow. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Danielle met his gaze, unflinching. I've been through worse. The next morning, Danielle met with Lisa and Detective Dawson in a small, windowless office at the precinct. Dawson's expression was skeptical as Danielle laid out what Ray had told her. A warehouse on Carson Street? Dawson repeated, leaning back in his chair. That's a long shot. It's the first real lead we've had, Danielle replied, her voice steady. We need to check it out. Dawson sighed, rubbing his temples. I'll see what I can do, but I can't just storm in without a warrant. I'll put surveillance on the place tonight, see who comes and goes. Lisa, sitting beside Danielle, nodded. If Barrett's people are there, it'll give us something solid to connect him to this network. Dawson glanced between the two women, his expression resigned. You two don't know when to quit, do you? No, Danielle said firmly. Not when people like Barrett are hurting innocent people. Dawson sighed again. All right, but you stay out of this for now. Let us do our job. Danielle said nothing, but the look in her eyes told Lisa everything. She would not sit back and wait. She could not. That night, as the sun set over the city, Danielle parked her truck a block away from the warehouse on Carson Street. The air was cold, and the industrial lot was quiet, save for the faint rumble of a distant train. Danielle sat in the driver's seat, watching the building with sharp, unblinking eyes. This is where it starts, she thought. This is how it ends. The industrial lot on Carson Street was dead quiet. The darkness almost absolute, except for a single flickering streetlight that cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. Danielle sat in her truck a block away, the engine off, her eyes locked on the warehouse ahead. The building was surrounded by rusted chain-link fences, its broken windows reflecting faint streaks of moonlight. To anyone else, it looked abandoned, forgotten. But Danielle knew better. This was a meeting point, a place where Barrett's people moved money and handed out orders. If Ray's information was right, this warehouse could be the key to exposing the entire operation. Danielle checked her watch, 10:42 p.m. It had been an hour since she parked, and so far, the warehouse remained quiet. She had already scoped out the perimeter earlier, taking note of two entrances, the large main rolling door, and a smaller side entrance tucked into the shadows. Both were padlocked, but not impenetrable. Pulling her jacket tighter around her, Danielle grabbed her binoculars and lifted them to her eyes. The faint outline of a figure appeared through the grimy windows, pacing slowly. Someone was inside. She lowered the binoculars and exhaled, steadying herself. This was it. She had already informed Detective Dawson about the location. Surveillance teams were supposed to arrive, but knowing the bureaucracy of the system, she was not holding her breath. There was no way she was waiting for them to miss their chance. Danielle slid out of the truck silently, landing on the pavement with practiced precision. She moved like a shadow, her steps soundless as she approached the fence. The chill of the night nipped at her face, but she ignored it, focusing only on the task at hand. Stay calm. Stay in control. Do not let them see you coming. She crouched near the side entrance, examining the lock. It was old and rusted, barely holding the door shut. Danielle pulled a small multi-tool from her pocket and got to work. Her movements were precise, her mind calm as she picked at the lock. Within moments, it gave way with a faint click. She pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, then eased it shut behind her. The interior of the warehouse was colder than outside. The air smelled of oil, damp metal, and faint traces of cigarette smoke. The only source of light came from a single bulb hanging overhead, casting a dim glow across the massive space. Stacks of wooden crates and metal drums were scattered throughout the room, providing plenty of cover. Danielle moved carefully, her breathing even, her ears tuned to the faintest sound. Ahead, she heard muffled voices, low and serious. She crept closer, ducking behind a stack of crates. Peering around the corner, she spotted 3 men standing near a folding table, papers and cash spread across it. One of the men was built like a linebacker, his broad shoulders filling out a heavy jacket. The second man was wiry, pacing nervously as he spoke. The third stood quietly, his face hidden under the brim of a ball cap. "You tell Barrett we're good for another month," the wiry man said, his voice sharp and urgent, "but people are getting skittish. Too much attention lately." The man with the cap replied, his voice calm and cold. "Then tell them to lay low. We don't stop until Barrett says so." Danielle's jaw tightened. There it is. Barrett's orders. Proof that he's calling the shots. She needed to get closer, close enough to hear more, close enough to see their faces. As she shifted forward, her boot hit a small metal bolt on the floor, sending it skittering across the concrete with a sharp clatter. The men froze. "What was that?" the wiry man hissed. "Check it out," the man with the cap ordered. Danielle's pulse quickened, but she stayed calm. She backed up silently, slipping behind another row of crates, just as one of the men came around the corner. She heard his footsteps getting closer, his breathing heavy. He paused, scanning the area. "Anyone there?" he called, his voice echoing through the empty warehouse. Danielle held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the shadows. The man lingered for another moment before muttering to himself and turning back. "Must have been a rat," he said as he rejoined the others. Danielle exhaled softly, her heart still steady despite the close call. She needed to get out of there and get this information to Dawson. If the police could catch these men in the act, they would have undeniable proof that Barrett was orchestrating the harassment. She moved back toward the side door, taking care to step lightly. But just as her hand reached the handle, the sound of tires crunching gravel outside made her freeze. Headlights cut through the cracks in the windows, spilling faint beams of light into the warehouse. "Who's that?" one of the men demanded. The man in the ball cap grabbed his phone, his voice sharp. "It's not supposed to be anyone else." "Pack it up! Now!" Danielle pressed her back against the wall, her mind racing. Whoever had just arrived was not part of the meeting. Barrett's people were spooked. She could hear the hurried rustle of cash being shoved into bags, the scrape of chairs as the men prepared to leave. A second set of footsteps approached the door. Someone was coming in. Danielle slipped her multi-tool back into her pocket and crouched low, her muscles tensed. The door creaked open, and a new figure stepped inside, a tall man in a heavy coat with sharp features and slicked-back silver hair. Charles Barrett. Danielle's breath caught in her chest. She could not believe it. Barrett himself had walked into the meeting. The men straightened as he approached, their nervous energy replaced by rigid obedience. "You idiots," Barrett said coldly, his voice echoing through the space. "You're sloppy. I told you to keep a low profile." The wiry man stammered, "We did, sir, but there's too much heat. The police—" "I don't care about excuses," Barrett interrupted, his voice ice. "If you can't handle it, I'll find someone who can. But this operation does not stop. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," the men mumbled in unison. Danielle's mind raced. "He's here, right here. If I can get this on record." She carefully pulled her phone from her jacket pocket, activating the audio recording app. Holding the phone steady, she recorded every word, her pulse pounding in her ears. Barrett continued, "Clean this place out tonight. Burn anything that might tie back to us. I'll handle the rest." "Yes, sir," the man with the cap said. Danielle's heart sank. "They're going to destroy the evidence," She had no choice. Now she needed to get out and alert Dawson before Barrett disappeared again. She turned to the door, moving as quietly as she could. But this time, her luck ran out. Her jacket brushed against a loose metal panel on the wall, the clang echoing through the warehouse. "Who's there?" Barrett snapped, his head snapping toward the sound. Danielle bolted. She threw open the side door and sprinted into the night, her boots pounding against the gravel. Behind her, shouts erupted as the men gave chase. "Get her!" Barrett roared. Danielle ducked behind a row of shipping containers, weaving through the maze of industrial debris. She could hear the men closing in, their voices growing louder. "She went this way! Find her!" Her truck was still a block away, hidden behind a line of trees. She had to get there. She pushed harder, her breath sharp and controlled as she ran. As she rounded the final corner, the headlights of her truck came into view. She fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking as adrenaline surged through her. Behind her, the shouts grew fainter. She had bought herself just enough of a head start. Danielle dove into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored it. Gravel sprayed behind her as the truck roared to life, speeding away from the warehouse. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wheel, her heart hammering in her chest. But she could not stop now. She had the recording proof that Barrett was behind everything. Proof that he was the mastermind. She pressed the gas pedal harder, her mind racing. "I've got you now, Barrett." Danielle's hands were still shaking as she drove through the darkened streets, the hum of the truck's engine steady but distant, like background noise. The recording she'd captured Barrett's voice, cold and undeniable, felt heavier than any weapon she had ever carried. For the first time since this fight began, she had a tangible piece of the truth, a tool that could finally shatter the facade Barrett had built. She glanced at her phone, sitting on the passenger seat. The faint red dot on the screen confirmed that the audio had saved. Barrett's words echoed in her mind. "Clean this place out tonight. Burn anything that might tie back to us." Danielle tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She knew what that meant. If the police did not move quickly, any evidence left in the warehouse would be gone by morning. She turned the truck onto a side street and pulled to the curb. Shifting into park, she grabbed her phone and hit the number she had memorized earlier, Detective Mike Dawson. He answered on the second ring. "Dawson, it's me," Danielle said, her voice low but urgent. "I have proof. Barrett's at the warehouse on Carson Street right now. I recorded everything." There was a pause. Then Dawson's voice sharpened. "What do you mean he's there?" "He showed up," Danielle said. "He's cleaning house tonight. If you wait until morning, it'll all be gone." "Damn it, Hayes," Dawson muttered. "What were you doing there alone?" Danielle ignored the question. "I don't have time for lectures, Detective. You need to get your team there now. I'll send you the recording as soon as we hang up." There was another pause, and then Dawson exhaled sharply. "Fine. Send it over. I'll call in the team and a judge for a warrant. Stay out of it this time. You hear me?" "I'll be watching," Danielle replied, already tapping her phone to send the audio file. "Hayes." She hung up before he could finish. Dawson might not like her methods, but Danielle had learned long ago that waiting for permission cost people their lives. Barrett had underestimated her, and now she had proof of his guilt. By the time Danielle reached the precinct, the building was alive with activity. Squad cars lined the curb, their lights casting red and blue streaks across the street. Officers moved quickly in and out, their voices clipped with purpose. Danielle stepped inside, the familiar hum of tension filling the air. Detective Dawson stood near the back, speaking with two uniformed officers. His face was tight with focus, his jaw set. When he spotted Danielle, he motioned her over. "You're lucky this panned out," he said, his tone a mix of frustration and begrudging respect. "We got the warrant. Teams are heading to the warehouse now. If your recording holds up, Barrett's done." Danielle nodded. "He knows the walls are closing in. He'll try to disappear." Dawson ran a hand through his hair. "We'll have eyes on him. For now, You stay here. I mean it, Hayes. Let us handle this. Danielle's gaze stayed steady on him. I'll let you do your job. Just make sure you finish it. Dawson shook his head but didn't argue. He turned and walked toward the operations center, where a large screen displayed the map of Carson Street and its surrounding area. Danielle lingered near the back of the room, watching as officers coordinated the raid. Lisa appeared at her side, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to Danielle with a raised eyebrow. You look like you could use this. Danielle accepted it, though her mind was still on Barrett. Dawson's team is moving in. I heard, Lisa said, her voice softer. You really did it, Danielle. That recording, it's exactly what we needed. Danielle nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It's not over yet. Barrett's smart. If he slips away, this was for nothing. Lisa studied her friend carefully. You're not responsible for all of this, you know. You've done more than anyone else already. Danielle's expression didn't waver. I don't stop halfway. Lisa sighed, leaning against the wall. I know. At the warehouse, red and blue lights pierced the darkness as police vehicles swarmed the area. Officers moved in swiftly, cutting locks, shouting commands, and sweeping the building with practiced efficiency. The men inside barely had time to react. One of Barrett's enforcers, a man in a cap who had been at the meeting earlier, was dragged out in handcuffs, his face twisted in anger. Another man, the wiry one, was slumped on the ground, his hands zip-tied behind his back. Inside the warehouse, cash, burner phones, and boxes of documents were being catalogued by officers. Dawson stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. He approached the table where piles of cash had been hastily left behind. He scanned the space and turned to an officer nearby. Get this all bagged up. I want it ready for evidence review by morning. The officer nodded, calling in additional hands to secure the materials. Dawson's phone buzzed, and he answered. Yeah? Did we get him? The voice on the other end crackled with static. Negative, sir. Barrett's not here. We checked the perimeter. He's gone. Dawson swore under his breath, his jaw tightening. Keep looking. He couldn't have gotten far. Back at the precinct, Danielle paced the hallway, her frustration mounting. It had been over an hour since the teams descended on the warehouse, and still there was no sign of Barrett. Lisa sat nearby, her laptop open as she monitored the flow of information coming in from the field. They got most of his crew, Lisa said, looking up, and they found enough evidence to tie Barrett to the network. Bank records, burner phones, cash, it's all there. But not him, Danielle muttered. Lisa hesitated. He'll slip up. Guys like Barrett always do. Danielle stopped pacing and stared out the window into the dark city beyond. He knows we're closing in. If we don't find him soon, he'll vanish. He's got the money, the connections, he can disappear overnight. As if on cue, Detective Dawson appeared at the end of the hall. His expression was hard, but there was a glint of something in his eyes, determination, or maybe a hint of respect. We got what we needed from the warehouse, Dawson said, but Barrett's in the wind. No sign of him yet. Danielle's fists clenched at her sides. He won't run forever. Men like him think they're untouchable. That arrogance will be his mistake. Dawson studied her for a moment, then nodded. We'll put his face out everywhere. Airports, bus stations, trains. He won't get far. As Dawson walked away, Danielle turned to Lisa, her voice steady but low. We're not waiting. Lisa blinked. What do you mean? Danielle grabbed her jacket. Barrett's running, but he's not leaving town yet. He's got unfinished business loose ends to tie up. We find out where he's going next, and we get there first. Lisa frowned, worry flashing across her face. Danielle, you heard Dawson. The police are on this. What are you going to do? Danielle's expression hardened. Whatever it takes. 2 hours later, Danielle and Lisa sat in Lisa's car, parked on a darkened street. Lisa had pulled up surveillance data from earlier raids, tracking the burner phones recovered from Barrett's men. There's been some movement, Lisa said, pointing to the screen. One of Barrett's numbers pinged near an old property he owns on the east side. It's a construction site been abandoned for months. Danielle stared at the map, her instincts firing. That's where he's hiding. It's isolated, out of sight. He's waiting for a way out. Lisa hesitated, her voice wary. Are you sure about this? What if it's a trap? Danielle's gaze stayed fixed on the map. Then I'll spring it. As she stepped out of the car, Lisa grabbed her arm. Be careful, Danielle. You don't have to do this alone. Danielle looked back at her, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I know, but this ends tonight. With that, Danielle disappeared into the shadows, the distant hum of the city, the only sound as she moved toward the construction site. Her mind was clear, her purpose sharp. Barrett had run out of time. The east side construction site loomed ahead, its skeletal structure rising like a ghost against the night sky. The area was desolate, half-finished buildings cast long, jagged shadows across the gravel lot. Beyond the perimeter fence, equipment lay abandoned, rusting under the weight of neglect. The site was silent, save for the faint rustle of wind slipping through steel beams and scaffolding. Danielle crouched behind a stack of wooden pallets near the entrance, her breath steady as she scanned the area. Lisa's lead had been good. There was movement here. A faint light flickered from the upper floor of the largest unfinished building, where a window stood partially covered by plastic sheeting. Barrett was here. She was certain of it. Her gut told her this would not be easy. Barrett was a man who planned for contingencies. If he was holed up here, waiting for an exit strategy, he would not be alone. There would be guards, hired men willing to do whatever it took to keep him protected. Stay sharp. Stay in control. Danielle pulled out her phone, typing a quick message to Lisa. At the site, Barrett's here. I'll handle it. Call Dawson. She hit send, slipped the phone into her jacket pocket, and moved silently toward the building. The gravel crunched faintly under her boots, but her steps were deliberate and measured. Danielle had spent years mastering the art of stealth. Her time as a Navy SEAL had prepared her for situations like this. Infiltration, control, and precision were second nature. As she approached the building, a muffled voice caught her attention. She pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, listening carefully. You think he's coming tonight? A man said, his voice carrying just enough to echo faintly. Doesn't matter, another replied. We're supposed to sit tight until Barrett says we're clear. He's making calls now, getting us a way out. Danielle frowned. Making calls? He's still trying to escape. She knew she had little time. If Barrett slipped through her fingers now, he could vanish for good, taking his operation and all the evidence against him into the wind. Inside the building, the air was thick with dust and the sharp smell of cement. Danielle moved through the unfinished halls like a shadow, pausing often to listen for footsteps or voices. The floor above her creaked faintly, signs of movement. She climbed a narrow metal staircase, her eyes sweeping each corner as she ascended. The glow of a single light bulb spilled out from a doorway at the far end of the second floor. Danielle tightened her grip on the multi-tool in her pocket, a small comfort, though she doubted she would need it. Her greatest weapons were her training, her instincts, and her resolve. As she approached the doorway, she heard Barrett's voice for the first time. I don't care how much it costs, just get me out of this city. His voice was clipped, laced with fury and desperation. By tomorrow, this whole thing will be blown wide open. Danielle stopped just outside the room, pressing her back against the wall. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This is it. Stepping into the doorway, Danielle's silhouette filled the frame, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Going somewhere, Barrett? Barrett turned sharply, his phone slipping from his hand. He was taller than she expected, his silver hair disheveled, his tailored coat wrinkled, as if he had been pacing for hours. His face paled when he saw her, his carefully curated mask of control cracking. How did you? Barrett started, his voice faltering. Danielle stepped fully into the room, her posture calm and commanding. "You left a trail, Barrett. Not as clean as you thought." Barrett recovered quickly, his expression hardening into a sneer. "You think you're clever, don't you? Showing up here like this, alone." "Clever enough to put the pieces together?" Danielle replied, her voice steady. "You sent Ray Curtis and his crew to intimidate innocent people. You used fear to drive families out of their homes, all so you could scoop up the properties and turn a profit." Barrett's lip curled. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Danielle said coldly. "A man who hides behind money and power. A man who thinks he's untouchable." Barrett's eyes narrowed, the smug confidence slipping further. "Do you think you're going to stop me? You have no idea what you're up against. People like me don't lose." Danielle took a step closer, her gaze sharp. "You've already lost. The police raided your warehouse. Your men are in custody. I have your voice on tape giving the orders. It's over, Barrett." For a moment Barrett froze, his face paling at the mention of the recording, but then his expression twisted with rage. "You don't understand, do you? You think this end with me? I'm one man, there will always be others." "Not tonight," Danielle replied. "You're done." Barrett's fists clenched at his sides, his desperation giving way to recklessness. "You really think I'm going quietly?" He nodded toward the shadows behind her. "You're outnumbered." Danielle heard the faint scrape of a boot behind her and turned just in time to see two of Barrett's men step forward, their faces hard and ready for a fight. One carried a crowbar, the other a hunting knife. Danielle's pulse quickened, but her expression remained calm. "You think I haven't faced worse?" The man with the crowbar lunged first, swinging in a wide arc. Danielle sidestepped smoothly, using his own momentum to push him off balance. She delivered a sharp elbow strike to his ribs, forcing a pained grunt from his lips as he staggered backward. The second man rushed her with the knife, his movements sloppy but dangerous. Danielle grabbed his wrist mid-swing, twisting sharply until he cried out and dropped the blade. She shoved him into the wall, knocking the air from his lungs. Barrett watched in shock as his men hit the ground, groaning and clutching their sides. He took an instinctive step backward, his face contorting with panic. "Going somewhere?" Danielle said, advancing toward him. Barrett's back hit the wall, his bravado completely shattered. "You can't do this," he stammered. "You have no idea what you're—" Danielle cut him off. "You're finished. The police are on their way. You're going to answer for everything you've done." As if on cue, the distant sound of sirens echoed through the building, growing louder with each passing second. Barrett's shoulders slumped, his face ashen. He knew it was over. Danielle stepped back, her voice calm but firm. "You brought this on yourself." Moments later, heavy footsteps pounded up the metal staircase. Detective Dawson appeared in the doorway, his weapon drawn and his gaze sharp. His team followed close behind, spreading through the room to secure Barrett and his men. Dawson's eyes met Danielle's briefly, a flicker of both exasperation and respect crossing his face. "You just can't stay out of trouble, can you?" Danielle shrugged faintly. "You're welcome." Dawson turned his attention to Barrett, now slumped against the wall as his hands were cuffed behind his back. "Charles Barrett, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." The rest of Dawson's words faded into the background as Danielle stepped out of the room, exhaling a long breath. The cold night air greeted her as she descended the stairs and walked across the gravel lot. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, casting shifting shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with every turn of the sirens. Lisa stood near the perimeter fence, her hands shoved into the pockets of her coat. When she spotted Danielle, she broke into a relieved smile. "I don't know how you keep pulling this off." Danielle stopped beside her, glancing back at the building where Barrett was being escorted into a waiting police car. "Persistence." Lisa's smile softened. You did it. He's done. Danielle stared at the scene before her, officers moving through the site, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The fight was over, but the damage Barrett had caused would take time to heal. It's a start, Danielle said quietly. But there's still work to do. Lisa nodded, her voice gentle. One battle at a time. Danielle looked up at the sky, the first faint streaks of dawn breaking across the horizon. For the first time in weeks, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. Justice was coming, and this time it would not stop halfway. The sharp morning light sliced through the gray sky as Danielle sat on the hood of her truck, parked across the street from the East Side construction site. The flashing lights of police cruisers still bathed the area in red and blue, but the chaos had given way to a slower, steadier rhythm. Officers logging evidence, taking statements, and coordinating the cleanup. Charles Barrett had been hauled off in handcuffs less than an hour ago, but his shadow lingered like a stain on the concrete. Danielle watched quietly, sipping from a coffee Lisa had brought her. She felt the dull ache of bruises forming beneath her jacket, a reminder of the fight from the night before. But the pain was insignificant compared to the weight she felt lifting off her shoulders. Barrett was in custody. His network was unraveling, one thread at a time. Lisa stood beside her, leaning against the truck with her laptop bag at her feet. Her eyes scanned the scene like a journalist cataloging every detail, but her face carried a rare softness. "So what now?" she asked, breaking the silence. Danielle looked straight ahead, her expression unreadable. "Now the real work starts." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Barrett's behind bars, his men are in custody, and the evidence is solid. What else is there to do?" Danielle set her coffee cup on the hood and turned to face her. "Barrett's done, but the damage he caused doesn't just disappear. The families he drove out, the businesses he ruined, the communities he terrorized, they'll need time to rebuild." Lisa's face softened further. "And what about you? You've been at this non-stop. Maybe you could take some time too." Danielle looked away, her jaw tightening. "I'm fine." Lisa didn't press her. She knew better than anyone that Danielle's quiet strength came at a price. The walls Danielle had built around herself didn't come down easily. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment. Detective Dawson appeared from the direction of the construction site, his coat billowing slightly in the cold morning breeze. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, but his expression carried a weight of satisfaction. "Hayes," he called, stopping a few feet away. "I thought you'd be halfway home by now." Danielle shrugged, crossing her arms. "Wanted to make sure it was done." Dawson gave her a knowing look. "It's done. Barrett's being processed as we speak. With the evidence we pulled from the warehouse and that recording you got, the DA is pushing for the maximum sentence. He's not going anywhere." "And Ray Curtis?" Danielle asked, her voice calm but pointed. Dawson sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Ray's cooperating. He'll testify against Barrett and his people, but it's part of a deal. He'll serve time, but not as much as he deserves." Danielle's jaw clenched. "He got off easy." "Maybe," Dawson admitted, "but without him, we wouldn't have gotten this far. Sometimes you take the wins where you can." He paused, studying her carefully. "I know you don't like it, but you did good here. Real good." Danielle nodded once, acknowledging the compliment, but saying nothing. She understood how the system worked, but it didn't mean she had to like it. "Anyway," Dawson continued, shifting his weight, "there's a community meeting tonight at the rec center. A bunch of the families affected by Barrett's crew will be there. You should come." Danielle blinked, caught off guard. "Why?" Dawson tilted his head slightly. "Because whether you like it or not, they know what you did. You rattled the cage, Hayes. You stood up for people when no one else would. They deserve to see the person who helped make this happen." Danielle frowned, shaking her head. "I didn't do this for recognition." "Doesn't matter," Dawson said simply. "Sometimes people just need to know someone's in their corner." He turned to walk back toward the site, but paused briefly. Think about it. That evening, Danielle sat behind the wheel of her truck, parked outside the community rec center. The building glowed warmly against the night, its windows lit from within. Groups of people drifted inside, families, small business owners, and neighbors huddled together, their voices murmuring softly. From her spot, Danielle could see Lisa standing near the door, chatting with an older woman holding a toddler. Lisa spotted her through the windshield and waved, but Danielle hesitated, her hand hovering near the door handle. She had faced war zones, combat missions, and men like Barrett without flinching. But this? Walking into a room full of people, letting herself be seen and acknowledged, that felt like an unfamiliar kind of battle. She wasn't used to being thanked. She wasn't used to letting people in. A faint knock on the driver's side window startled her. She turned to find Lisa grinning at her, her breath fogging up the glass. "You're just going to sit here all night?" Lisa teased. Danielle rolled down the window, her face neutral. "I don't know if I should go in." Lisa's smile softened. "Why not?" Danielle looked back at the rec center, watching families file through the doors. "I don't belong in there." Lisa sighed, leaning on the truck door. "Look, you don't have to go in there and make a speech or anything, but you do belong. Those people don't just need to rebuild their community. They need hope. You gave them that." Danielle exhaled slowly, her mind turning over Lisa's words. Finally, she nodded and stepped out of the truck. Inside, the rec center buzzed with quiet energy. Folding chairs had been set up in rows, with people scattered throughout the room, chatting in small groups. A long table near the front held coffee, cookies, and paper cups. Kids played near the back, their laughter cutting through the hum of conversation. Danielle kept to the edges, her presence quiet and unassuming. She spotted Lisa across the room, talking to Detective Dawson and a few other familiar faces. As she scanned the crowd, a woman approached her hesitantly, a woman in her 50s with short graying hair and weary eyes. "You're her, aren't you?" the woman asked softly. "The one who stopped them." Danielle stiffened, unsure how to respond. Thank you," the woman said before she could finish. Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze was steady. "They ran my son's store out of business. He thought we'd lose everything. But because of you, they're gone. We have a chance now." Danielle felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. "I'm glad you're safe," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. The woman nodded, wiping at her eyes quickly. "You didn't have to do what you did, but you did it anyway. That matters." As the woman walked away, others began to notice Danielle. A man in a plaid jacket approached to shake her hand, thanking her for helping his sister's family. A teenager nodded shyly as she passed, her whispered, "Thank you," barely audible. Danielle accepted their gratitude with quiet humility, her walls softening with each interaction. Lisa appeared at her side, smiling warmly. "See, this is what I was talking about." Danielle shook her head faintly, her voice low. "I didn't do this for thanks." "I know," Lisa replied. "But they need to see that someone stood up for them, someone who didn't back down." Danielle glanced around the room, taking in the faces of people who had been hurt by Barrett's greed and cruelty, people who could now breathe a little easier because the man responsible was behind bars. The weight on her shoulders lightened, replaced by something steadier, something warmer. Dawson approached, holding a paper cup of coffee. "Looks like you made some friends," Danielle smirked faintly. "Not bad for a loner," Dawson chuckled. "Take the win, Hayes. You've earned it." Danielle looked out across the room one last time, the sounds of laughter and conversation filling the space. Barrett's empire had been built on fear, but these people, these families were stronger than he ever realized. They were resilient. They would rebuild. As she walked toward the exit, Lisa fell into step beside her. "So, what's next?" Danielle's expression was thoughtful as she pushed open the doors, the cold night air rushing to meet her. Whatever comes, Lisa grinned. Knowing you, that won't take long. Danielle smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the horizon as they stepped into the night. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when Danielle parked her truck in front of a small, weathered building with a faded sign that read, Community Center. It sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, one of the areas Barrett's men had targeted. But today, the air felt different, brighter. The scars left behind by Barrett's network were still there, but there were signs of renewal, 2 fresh coats of paint on old doors, flowers planted in small patches of earth, and children playing outside again. Danielle stepped out of her truck and took a moment to take it all in. It was a modest sight, but one that gave her an unfamiliar sense of hope. Change starts small, she reminded herself. The center's main door opened, and Lisa stepped out, waving at her. Her energy was as upbeat as ever, despite the early hour. Her laptop bag slung across her shoulder. "You're early," Lisa teased as Danielle approached. "I wasn't expecting you for another hour." Danielle smirked faintly. "I like to beat traffic." Lisa rolled her eyes. "Sure you do." She gestured for Danielle to follow her inside. "Come on, the meeting is already starting. You're going to want to see this." Inside, the community center was buzzing with quiet activity. People moved in and out of the main room, arms full of supplies, paint buckets, rolls of carpet, and boxes labeled donations. The air was filled with conversation and laughter, the sound warm and welcoming. It was a far cry from the atmosphere Danielle had grown used to. In recent weeks, no tension, no fear. She spotted familiar faces as she walked with Lisa. Families she had seen at the rec center meeting, small business owners who had been forced to close, and teenagers who no longer had to look over their shoulders in their own neighborhoods. They were working together now, focused on rebuilding what had been taken from them. Lisa led Danielle into the main room, where a group of volunteers had gathered around a table covered with flyers, maps, and sign-up sheets. At the head of the table stood Detective Dawson, sleeves rolled up and a cup of coffee in hand. He looked up when he saw them and offered a small smile. "Look who decided to join us," Dawson said. "Figured you'd be halfway out of town by now." "Not yet," Danielle replied, glancing at the table. "What's all this?" "Rebuilding," Dawson said simply. He set his coffee down and picked up one of the flyers, handing it to her. "We're starting a program, cleaning up the neighborhoods." Barrett's crew tried to destroy repairing buildings, reopening businesses, and supporting families who were forced out. People are signing up to help however they can. Danielle looked over the flyer. It was straightforward, printed with bold letters across the top. "Rebuild together, restoring our community." Below it were photos of neighborhoods, smiling families, and local businesses that had been impacted. She could see the marks of hope on every line of the page. Dawson continued, "The evidence we pulled from Barrett's operation is holding up in court. With his conviction, the properties he bought under shady deals will be returned to the city. The DA's office is coordinating with local leaders to give those spaces back to the people who deserve them." Danielle's brow lifted slightly. "And what's your part in all this?" Dawson smirked. "I'm volunteering. This goes beyond a police job, Hayes. You rattled the cage, but now it's our job to make sure the dust settles the right way. You should consider sticking around for a while. People here could use someone like you." Danielle shook her head faintly. "I'm not much of a community organizer, Dawson." "You don't have to be," Lisa chimed in, nudging her shoulder. "Just being here means something. People are showing up because they believe this fight is worth it, and you're part of the reason why." Danielle looked down at the flyer again, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirring inside her. She had spent so long operating on the outskirts, fighting battles in the shadows, always moving to the next problem, the next conflict. She was used to leaving once the dust settled, letting others rebuild. This time, though, she felt tethered. The faces around her, The energy in the room, it was pulling her in, urging her to stay. By mid-morning, Danielle found herself painting the walls of an old storefront alongside a group of volunteers. The building had once been a family-owned bakery before Barrett's men vandalized it and drove the owners out. Now the room smelled of fresh paint and wood polish, the beginnings of something new. A teenage boy worked beside her, carefully rolling blue paint onto the lower half of the wall. He glanced at her with curiosity. "You're the one who stopped them, right? The people who were messing with this place?" Danielle paused, the paintbrush hovering in her hand. "I helped," she said simply. The boy nodded, dipping his roller back into the paint tray. "My mom said people like that always get away with it, but they didn't this time." Danielle looked at him, her voice soft. "No, they didn't." The boy smiled faintly and kept painting. Danielle turned back to the wall, a small warmth settling in her chest. "This is why you keep fighting," she thought. Hours later, Danielle stepped outside to catch her breath. The sun was high in the sky now, warming the concrete sidewalk. She spotted Lisa across the street, laughing with a group of kids as she handed out bottled water. Detective Dawson stood near the corner, speaking with one of the shop owners, his usual sharp demeanor softened by the atmosphere. Danielle leaned against the storefront, wiping a smudge of paint from her cheek. For the first time in a long time, she felt something close to peace, not because the fight was over, but because she could finally see the impact of what they had fought for. Lisa appeared beside her, handing her a water bottle. "You're not so scary when you're holding a paintbrush, you know." Danielle chuckled softly. "Don't get used to it." Lisa grinned. "I think I might." She paused, her tone growing more thoughtful. "You know, you could stay, Danielle. This place could use someone like you, someone who doesn't back down." Danielle stared out at the street, watching as families walked past, children ran by laughing, and business owners swept out their doorways. The neighborhood still bore its scars, but it was alive again, resilient. "I don't know if I'm the staying kind," Danielle said finally, though the words felt less certain than they once would have. Lisa tilted her head, studying her friend. "Maybe it's time to try something new." Danielle didn't answer right away. She let the quiet settle between them, her gaze fixed on the families that passed by, their laughter, their warmth, their strength. Finally, she exhaled, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe," Lisa grinned, nudging her playfully. "That's progress." Danielle shook her head with a quiet chuckle, but deep down, she felt something shifting, like a door she had kept locked for too long was beginning to open. The fight against Barrett had been about more than taking down one man. It had been about giving people back their sense of safety, their hope, and their right to live without fear. For the first time in years, Danielle realized she didn't need to keep running to find purpose. It was right here, in moments like this, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who refused to give up. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the sounds of the neighborhood hummed around her, Danielle allowed herself to smile. The battles would come and go, but for now, there was peace. And maybe, just maybe, a new beginning. A week later, Danielle stood at the edge of the park where it had all begun. The late afternoon sun dipped low behind the trees, casting golden light across the playground. Families filled the area once again. Children's laughter echoed from the swings. Couples sat on benches, and groups of teenagers played basketball on the courts nearby. The park felt alive again, reclaimed by the people it belonged to. Barrett and his network were dismantled, and the neighborhood, though scarred, was healing. It would take time, but progress was already showing. The bakery she had helped paint was reopening the following week, and families displaced by Barrett's schemes were beginning to return home. Danielle stood quietly, watching from a distance. A mother knelt to tie her son's shoelace, a small smile on her face as they both laughed. It was such a simple moment, but one that reminded Danielle why she had fought so hard. This was what mattered: people living without fear, safe to enjoy the lives they deserved. Lisa appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look like someone who's finally breathing again," she teased, handing one to Danielle. Danielle smirked faintly and took the cup. "Maybe I am." Lisa sipped her coffee, her expression growing serious. "You made a difference, Danielle. People are starting to believe in their own strength again. That's not something everyone can say." Danielle looked at her, a quiet resolve in her eyes. "It wasn't just me. People like you, Dawson, the volunteers, they're the reason this community is standing strong again." Lisa tilted her head, smiling. "Still, it helps to have someone like you leading the charge." Danielle glanced back at the park, her gaze softening. "If there's one thing I learned through this, it's that fighting for what's right doesn't end when the battle's won. It's about making sure what you fought for stays protected." Lisa nodded, a hint of pride in her voice. "So what now? Are you sticking around for good?" Danielle chuckled softly, taking a sip of her coffee. "We'll see. I might still have some fight left in me." Lisa grinned. "Something tells me you always will." The 2 women stood there in comfortable silence, watching as the park hummed with life. Danielle felt a warmth she had not felt in years, a sense of peace and quiet purpose. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about what came next. She was content to simply be. The story of Danielle Hayes reminds us of the power of perseverance and courage. It shows that even when the odds seem stacked against us, one person, one action can inspire real change. Whether standing up for those who cannot fight for themselves or helping a community rebuild, the smallest ripple can lead to waves of transformation. In a world where fear and division may sometimes seem overwhelming, stories like Danielle's remind us to keep pushing forward, to stand together, and to never give up hope. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more stories of courage, hope, and resilience, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Share this video with friends and family to spread the message of strength and kindness. Together, let's keep inspiring hope, one story at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next one.